Hi, welcome to this last mini lecture for our last module of the term. So in it, I would like to just go over a couple of last things. The first is that there is critique of feminist wave theory. That is, some feminists criticize that feminist history, women's movements are taught by waves, first wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave. They fear that waves give people the impression that there were only women and allies fighting for change during those peak times in our American history. But that's not true. And we should know that that's not true. There have always been progressive people fighting, revolutionary people fighting for progress and social justice, such as Alice Paul. She's one great example. The one that you saw in Iron Jawed Angels, who started the National Women's Party. And she was one of the main reasons that the 19th Amendment passed and got women the right to vote. She dedicated her entire life to fighting for women's issues and just, moving the needle forward. She never married. She never had a family. She died in her, old age, but never stopped working for women's progress. In between the peak waves, first wave, second wave, third wave, you have to consider that there have always been doctors, educators, lawmakers, parents, social workers. There have always been people, regular people in all areas of society fighting the good fight, always pushing the needle forward, filing sexual harassment lawsuits, and so on. And all these things did not just take place during waves. They were happening in between waves and during waves. But waves, the wave is a great metaphor to use when teaching women's history because it shows that that's when forces, get momentum. The wave rises, it grows, it becomes, big, and then it results in a visible break that the larger society cannot ignore, right? Like, hear us roaring. Something's got to shift here. And so that's why we use the wave analogy when we talk about women's histories. But there is some pushback against teaching it that way because of the fear that students may walk away thinking that progress took place only because of that time. A good analogy is thinking of African American history. Most Americans, when asked about what they know about African Americans in the US, will name two time periods. In school, we're taught about slavery, and then we know about civil rights. And there's a good decade between the end of slavery and the civil rights movement. And most people just recall those two things. But obviously, there were major things happening in the African American community, horrendous things being done to the African American community. And then, of course, revolutionaries, activists, freedom fighters, all throughout history, trying to get equity and fairness and just basic humanity and respect for African Americans. It wasn't just during these two time periods. So now that we end the term, we realize that fourth wave really looks at feminism as under the broader umbrella of social justice. Social justice, by nature, that whole umbrella is inclusive and takes the intersectional approach, which fourth wave feminists, are committed to. So some people still want to call themselves feminists. Some people call them social justice activists. I want to give you some examples of some of the issues today. that are part of the social justice movement, but they are also feminist concerns, right? There, if you look at it as a Venn diagram, feminism is part of social justice. So things such as in other areas globally, there's a fight for access to free, clean water. Um, Fighting for attention to the unsolved femicide, which is the disappearance and murder of women and girls. For example, in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, and the indigenous women in the US, this high number of unsolved mass crimes against women. Um, Child marriage, for example, having kids, little girls married off in different parts of the world um, to older men or sometimes old men. Um, it's a tribal practice oftentimes. Marriage agreement between families to um, settle a dispute about a debt or something gone wrong. The elders in the family will arrange for a little girl to belong to a man. I mean, it's not marriage the way we consider marriage necessarily, but by giving her over to that family, it's considered child marriage. Health concerns, right? In certain parts of Africa, there's still female genital mutilation, the cutting of part of the clitoris or the whole clitoris, or the cutting of the vaginal, the labia, or sewing the lips shut. Um, that's a horrendous health concern. Many girls die in adolescence or trying to give birth to their first child. Um, Attention to media misogyny, especially in advertisement and entertainment. Attention to foreign factories in places like Mexico, Taiwan, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, Vietnam. So places that have foreign factories, primarily first world developed countries like the United States, um, Germany, Japan, they go to certain parts of the world because their profits are higher there. Um, so attention to how women and girls who are recruited to work in these factories, how they're treated. That's a social justice, feminist concern as well. Violence against queer people. Um, in the United States, there's a more organized movement to look at how we have bathrooms set up, right? They're very gendered. So the fight for trans bathrooms or just non-gendered bathrooms. Of course, there's Time's Up, Me Too. Oops, I have Time's Up twice. Um, I think I should have Black Lives Matter. That's what I meant to have there. The fight for free childcare, free preschool, paid family leave time for both mothers and fathers, or same-sex couples, two fathers or two mothers. So having paid family leave and their job guaranteed when they return back from their time off. All of these issues, if you look at them, you could start to see, okay, some of these are definitely happening in the United States. Some of these are taking place in other parts of the world. Some of these take place in the US and other countries. So you could start to see that social justice is broad, and what is maybe a feminist social justice concern elsewhere might seem very basic. Like, yeah, of course, people should not be sewing the labia of little girls shut, right? Of course, they shouldn't have their health organs like their clitoris removed. But if you look at these, regardless of whether they're taking place in developed nations or in a developed nation, the one thing that they all have in common, they're all women's issues. What is their common denominator? Well, they're all looking at paying attention, forcing society to pay attention to individuals which when there are a lot of people affected by the same thing, then it becomes a group need. But looking at what is a basic human being's need in order for a person to have freedom to be who they are and have access to good health and well-being and opportunities to be all that they can be to reach their fullest potential, regardless of their identity markers, gender, religion, disabilities, sex, race, ethnicity, their sexuality, their class status. These are called identity markers, and when people in a particular group are denied maybe, one of these, then that limits a whole group of people full access to live their full human lives. And that is the basic women's fight for centuries. And now social justice has taken this on. And speaking of gender, if we go back, the first identity marker that women have used to say, okay, we are, 51 or 52% of the population, that's a lot of people to have these things denied to them. But then third wave, fourth wave started looking at gender as not necessarily tied to their biological sex, their chromosomes. As we know, there are some people who identify as girls, as female, and their sex at birth was determined to be male. So we're going to end this term looking at the difference between the term sex and the term gender. What's the difference? They are not one and the same, but they do overlap sometimes. So we're going to have two videos in this module to take a look at that, the difference, and to see why social justice now doesn't, a lot of people who are social justice advocates and activists, they don't want to say they're just feminists because that implies women's issues only. So they say they're fighting for social justice, which is intersectional by nature and does look, it's more inclusive of gender because that includes trans and non-conforming, non-binary individuals. What I'd like you to keep in mind is that for your final research project, it's just a mini research project. I want you to spend the next couple of days reading, looking up sources, information, videos, discussions on any contemporary issue of concern in any society in the world. It could be in Europe, Africa, it could be in Australia, a region of the United States, Latin America, wherever. What is a contemporary social justice issue that is of concern to feminists? Of course, I want you to take an intersectional approach. That means that you can include and should pay attention to issues of how class or their nationality or their abilities or their basic human needs become ignored or how their opportunities are limited. You're going to share your information with your classmates in a 10-minute video or an audio file or a Prezi or a PowerPoint, or you could write a 1,000-word essay sharing what you have learned, what issue of concern you focused on, and I'm happy to give you examples of past classes